Good to see each of you this morning. Welcome back, FAFs from their long travels. And Donahoe, it's good to see you today. We've been praying for you guys with your health concerns, and really good to see you out here this morning. And just really grateful that all of you could be here today. Today, I want to just admit right up front, this is not probably going to be the easiest message for me to preach, and really kind of for a couple reasons. One is I keep getting these texts from my sister-in-law, who is with my mom this morning, and my brother, they happen to be visiting from Nebraska up in South Dakota, and mom's not been well. And so she had a rough morning, and so I keep getting these texts that keep taking me back to where I'm trying to escape from for the hour, you know. So just thinking about that a little bit. So I want to admit that, but there's also probably a more significant reason that today is going to be difficult, because today's topic is one that I struggle with. And honestly, this might be the hardest question in this series for me to address from a personal standpoint. And the reason is simply this: like a preacher, like we only work one day a week. That's the old joke or whatever. What people don't understand is just how much work goes into the other 4 days, not to prepare the message, but to prepare the preacher. Like to get my heart to that place where I'm ready to serve, and to make sure that I'm building the relationships with the church that I need to be able to speak into the areas of life that I know are important to you as well. And so that's the biggest part of the work, though. And this one, just to be honest, wrestling with this topic this week has been difficult. Because I don't know about you, but I struggle sometimes with today's question. Like, have I really been forgiven? And the flip side of that is, have I really forgiven? And these two things really plague me. Now, the first one, I know in my head, is just taken care of. And if I didn't know that, we've just reminded ourselves of that this morning. We came around this table. We remember that it's not anything that we do or anything that we are that brings us the forgiveness of God in our life. It's who God is, and it's what He has done for us through His Son Jesus when He gave Jesus as a sacrifice for our sins. And so I know that in my head. But where I struggle is with these people that I've come across in my life, from early days until yesterday. You know, people who I know I've offended, or people who have offended me in some way, shape, or form, or some offense that has been done. And I don't know, so when I think about that, this message really isn't prepared. It's not that I don't know what to say, I've got that. But preparing myself for this message, it's like all week long I kept thinking about people. And you probably don't even know any of them, really. The ones that have been hard for me to let go of, or the names that have been, that instantly bring that little feeling on the back of my neck, or that just bring back the memories that I don't want to remember. What I've come to realize is that by now I should be a professional at this. Like, I should be a pro forgiver. I'll never be a pro football player. I'm never going to play professional baseball. But I should be forgiving at a professional level. Like, if anybody should be in the Forgiving Hall of Fame, it's me. Last week I had the chance, or not last week, last year I had the chance, the church gave me some time off, and I had a chance to go to Louisville, Kentucky. I don't know, are any of you from Kentucky? Good. So whether I say Louisville or Louisville or Louisville, you aren't going to complain about that. But I had a chance to be at the Louisville Slugger factory. Matter of fact, the guy that owns it took us on a tour. There were 8 of us preachers together, plus Bob Russell, who is a preacher in that town, who happened to baptize the guy that runs this factory. And then the factory owner, his son-in-law, was there as well. And they spent basically half a day with us. They invested in our leadership and taught us some great principles of leadership. Then they took us out on the factory floor and they showed us how they selected the wood. And they went through and opened up the bat vault and showed us all these amazing bats that different people use and showed us the slight difference that Ty Cobb's bat, which was pretty heavy when I held it, Ty Cobb's bat compared to Jackie Robinson's back or bat. And by the way, I just thought I had to put this up there because I got my picture taken with Jackie Robinson. I never thought that would happen. And the even cooler part is, I was 53 when I had it taken, and he was 53 when he passed. So it's like, it was meant to be, I think. Just one of those God-ordained moments. But I always loved Jackie Robinson because he was a guy that, if there was anybody that overcame to make it, Jackie Robinson overcame to make it. And I don't even deserve to tell his stories because I don't know his story well enough. But did you see the movie 42? That was an amazing movie. And what an amazing man. But he overcame so much to play at a very high level, and he refused to lose. As a matter of fact, that was basically his thing. Like, I hate losing. If you look up, top 10 quotes of Jackie Robinson, that one will be there every time. I hate losing. And so he was determined to play at the highest level and play at his highest level every time he stepped on the field. And I have a similar picture of this that I've shown you before, so I didn't put it up here. But one time I put a picture up here of the world's best golfer at the time and the world's worst golfer at the time. You can guess which one I was, but I had a chance to go follow the pros around on a golf course one time, and I got my picture taken with Justin Thomas. And, here we were in this picture together, and I told him that when I took the picture, this is awesome. Now I have a picture of the best golfer in the world with the worst golfer in the world. He said, oh, that's not true. He didn't come watch me golf. I went and watched him golf. When it comes to golfing, I couldn't make it in the minor leagues. When it comes to baseball, maybe, back in the day. As a matter of fact, if you ever get to Louisville, and you go to the Louisville Slugger Museum and you take the tour, one of the things that they have is they have a batting cage that you can go in. And we weren't just able to go, we were required to go. And there was going to be a prize for whoever could hit the most balls. And basically we were getting paid to hit baseballs. And so Bob Russell told us, now, you need to give your best to this. You get 10 swings here. Make them count. And I'll just let you know that with Willie Mays' bat, I went 8 for 10. I don't know if Willie Mays went 8 for 10. You know what I'm saying? He probably did. But my guess is they were throwing the ball about 40 miles an hour faster than I was hitting it at the time. So it was a bit of a cheat there. But the bottom line is, I should be a major league forgiver. I'll never be a major league hitter, major league football player, major league, but I should be able to forgive because it's that often that I've needed to forgive. And I don't know if that's because I'm so sensitive, or if I'm easily offended, or if it's just that I spend my life with a lot of people. If I had to guess, some of you in here have become professional forgivers. After all, you're still coming to listen to me preach, so you have to be gracious in some way, shape, or form. But I want to talk about some tips that I picked up from the pros, not about baseball or golf, but about forgiveness. And that's what I want us to focus on today. Now, if I could get away with it, I would stand up here and read an article from Lewis B. Smedes, who was a theologian and professor, an ethics professor at Fullerton in California at Fuller Seminary. I don't know why I just said Fullerton. Fuller Seminary in Fullerton, California. And in 1988, I had the opportunity to learn about forgiveness from him. Not because he visited our seminary or our college, but because I was desperate for forgiveness. Have you ever been there, like, something is just not right? I'm not talking about the microphone, although that might be the case too. I don't think it's me, but have you ever been in that spot where it's like life is just not right? And you go through and you figure out what it is, and all of a sudden it's like, oh. I'm bitter about something. I'm resentful about something. And all of a sudden, you're able to put your finger on it. It's like, oh, that's what I'm resentful about. This is what I've not forgiven. And that's what it was for me. I was really struggling with forgiving other people, and I was struggling because I didn't really embrace the opportunity to forgive. I had already accepted the fact that Jesus could forgive my sins and that Jesus would forgive my sins, but I wasn't giving him the chance to forgive me because I wasn't acknowledging the sin in my life at that level. And so I went and I found this book from Dr. Smedes about forgiveness. It's just a little paperback, and it's still in my office today. If you open it, it would probably crumble into pieces because I haven't been back to the book for a few years, but in the early days, I used this book a lot. Because I needed to learn that I had been forgiven so that I could forgive others. But I also came across an article that he preached, and I wanted, or that he shared, and it was based on a message I think that he actually preached. But I wanted to share just a few things from this article with you. I actually wanted to share the whole article with you, so I did on Facebook. So if you go to Facebook and you click on the link, there's a PDF there to Dr. Mead's message on this, but I wanted to just share a few things that he says in there. He starts the article by saying this: we are anxious in the face of our unchangeable past. We long to receive segments of our private histories, but we are stuck with them. So in this article, he identifies two areas that lead us to struggle with forgiveness. And he talks about them in two basic ways. He says there's the past, and there's the future. There's this past that we feel like is absolutely unchangeable. And then he goes on to say, we're anxious in the face of our unpredictable futures. We long to control our destinies, but we cannot bring them under our management. Now, I want you to think about your own life. Do you have anxiety over your past? The things that you've done that you wish you could change? Do you spend much time thinking about your past? Like, oh, if I would have went here or done this, or if I never would have got to know that person, or if I'd have had another baby, or all these different things that hold us and hold our past over us. And Dr. Smead says, there's something about what happened yesterday that's unchangeable, and we want to change it, and so that frustrates us. And there's something about tomorrow that is unpredictable. Because we're not the ones in control of tomorrow. I know that many of you think you are. After all, you filled out your day planner 6 months ago, and you know what's supposed to happen to you tomorrow, right? You feel like you're in control of tomorrow, but can I be honest with you? I think Dr. Smead's right. We don't know where tomorrow is headed like we think we do. We can't bring every detail of tomorrow under our management. And he finishes that little section by saying we cannot alter a painful past or control a threatening future. You know, anxiety is a huge issue for our culture today, especially post-COVID. We're seeing it. I've said this before. I don't know anybody that I know of that's like 20 to 30 years old that isn't either on anxiety medication or dealing with their anxiety in counseling right now. It's just there's just a huge amount of anxiety that's been created, especially amongst some of our younger people. But in reality, I think most of us really struggle with this anxiety. And Dr. Smeads has hit it really on point when he says it either has to do with our unchangeable past or unpredictable future. These are the things that make us most anxious. So if you think about what you're anxious about right now, does it fall into one of those two categories? Potentially, right? Potentially. Dr. Smeads went on to say, God offers two answers to our deepest anxieties. The first one is this: He's a forgiving God who recreates our pasts by forgiving them. He is a forgiving God who recreates our pasts by forgiving them. He is a promising God who controls our future by making and keeping promises. So the fact that we have this forgiving God and this promising God, this is what pulls us out of that anxiety over our past and over our future. He has the final word in what we view as our unchangeable past. And he has the final word and final say in our unpredictable future. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about the future today. I want to talk about the past a little bit and how forgiveness goes into that. He said, by forgiving us, God changes our past. And by promising, he secures our future. By his grace, we participate in his power to change the past and control the future. We too can forgive, and we must forgive. We too can make a promise and keep it. So let's talk about this past and the unchangeable past. Is it possible to change the past? I mean, I saw Back to the Future, and I saw what happens when you mess with the past. Right? Is it possible? Yes. So Smedes goes on to talk about this, what forgiveness looks like. And he talks about 3 stages, and I want to talk about these 3 stages just briefly. The first stage in every act of forgiveness is simply this: suffering. Suffering. We go through something that's painful. It's what C.S. Lewis called, and C.S. Lewis is my second pro I'm going to refer to today. Dr. Smedes is the first pro. The second pro was probably Dr. Lewis, C.S. Lewis. And he says, unforgiveness is a spiritual abscess that poisons the soul. The only remedy for which is forgiveness, no matter how difficult. Now that sounds a little bit like the present, right? Because we have this abscess in our soul over something that happened in the past. It's created a void or a painful growth in us. I like the image really of a tumor. It's created a tumor in our soul. Sometimes it feels like a brain tumor because we can't ever get that little thing out of our head that we need to forgive. There's something that has happened to us that we need to forgive, or maybe there's something we need to be forgiven for. These two things are very closely related. But there's something that we just can't get out of our head, and it's growing and growing. And if we could do what these doctors are doing, and we could pull out our soul and take a look at it and map it, we could pinpoint that very thing that's keeping us from being able to embrace God's forgiveness in our life and give that forgiveness freely to other people, if we could just pinpoint what it is. And that's Dr. Smedes' second thing. He says the first thing is we got to understand that there's suffering. It creates the conditions that require forgiveness. When you have pain, you go in to the doctor and say, something hurts. You know, when I do this, it hurts. And the doctor doesn't just say to you, well, don't do this. Let's look at it. Let's go in. Let's get you scanned. Go in and do a scan of you. And let's identify exactly what it is and prepare to deal with what's going on. And we do that in our soul. We take an inventory, a spiritual inventory of what's going on in our soul so that we can do what Dr. Smedes calls spiritual surgery. That's the second act of forgiveness, or the second stage of forgiveness. And this is the essential business of removing the memory. That's what he says. You know, a lot of times we like to say, well, let's just forgive and forget. Forgetting is an action. It's an active attempt. As a matter of fact, later in the message, you're going to hear me say, really, when we say, you know, we're going to forget about it, just forget about it. When somebody sins against us, just forget about it. What are we really saying? I don't want to deal with it. Just forget about it. Our goal isn't necessarily to forgive and forget. It's to forgive and remember to forgive. But Dr. Smedes says we've got to take that memory that's there and we got to figure out what it was. What was it about this that hurt us? And we have to acknowledge that hurt. Initially, just between us and God. Sometimes between us and other people. But to start with, we've got to acknowledge that what happened actually hurt us. The problem with that is if this is a person that continues to hurt us, that we've given power in our life, that has some sort of power in our life, it's awful hard to let go of that. And it's even harder to humble ourselves to it and say, that hurts. You hurt me, because it's like we're giving them more and more power. Dr. Smead says, until you acknowledge that it's there, that you have been hurt, you can't forgive. You can't deal with that tumor until you identify what it is and what is causing it to grow and what is giving it the power in your life. And then the third stage that he identifies is simply this idea of starting over. How do we get to the point where we can start over? And he says this is the climax of the whole thing. This is where you know that forgiveness has taken place, and that's when you begin a new relationship with that person. And I know some of you already are like, wait a minute. I know I need to forgive, but you're saying I need to reconcile? You're saying I need to get to that point where we have a brand new relationship? Well, he talks a little bit about that in the article, and I'd encourage you to read it if this is something that truly interests you. You know, there are probably times that we're not going to be able to start a new physical relationship with someone. But what he's talking about is a mental or a spiritual relationship that says, that person now stands forgiven in my mind and in my heart. And I'm letting go of the pain and the bitterness and the hurt. We're going to watch a video in a little bit from another third professional, a little 4-minute video from Doug Fields about forgiveness. And in there, you're going to kind of see a suggestion that he says, you know, this is how you forgive. And we'll talk about that how a little bit after we watch that video. But this is the way that Dr. Smead describes this forgiveness. He says, when you forgive someone, you slice away the wrong from the person who did it. Now, that doesn't mean take a knife to them. That's what you want to do, but that's not what you're doing. You're looking at your memory, you're thinking about what caused this, and you decide to remove that memory. You know, if you're a computer person, this is where the program has a flaw, so you delete it and you reinstall it. And that person that had that flaw or that problem, you delete them and you reinstall them new. And most of us feel like this isn't possible. Dr. Smead goes on to say, you disengage the person from the act. Now, before you say, I can't do that, I want you to think about the easiest person in your life to forgive. Like the person in your life that would be hardest for you to hold a grudge against. I think for me, and this will be different for everybody in the room, but for me, my mother was probably the best person at letting go of my mistakes, of the pain I caused her. And she still has to do it today. We have this joke that we tell, and it really isn't funny, especially if it were true. It would definitely not be funny. But I have two older brothers, and they are just mean as could be, or they were back in the day. Now they're all pastors, and I don't know, they're probably not as mean as I remember them being when they were young. But I remember when they were in middle school, and I was about 5 years younger than them, so I was like half their age, okay? And I remember how mean they could be to me. I don't remember how mean I could be to them, right? But I remember how mean they could be to me. And, I'd go and talk with my mom about it. And, she knew how mean I could be to them. But she would overlook that, and she would mother me. And she would respond to the pain and the struggle. My dad is a whole different animal, I can tell you that right now. Maybe you have somebody in your life. Maybe it's not a mother, maybe it's a daughter, maybe it's a son, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a grandparent. I don't know who it is. But that person that you just don't have any problem forgiving, or that you can do no wrong in their eyes, that type of a thing. Well, that's the best that person is probably the best model for you for who God is in our life, with the exception of that person probably doesn't require you to make up for the debts. My mom just overlooks them. My God paid for them. My God doesn't just overlook my problems or overlook my sin. He paid the price for them. He sent his son to die for my sin, for your sin, and that paid the price. It paid the ultimate price. And in doing so, it made it possible that we don't have to charge others for the debts that they incur from us. When they do something wrong against us, we can just chalk it up to the debt that's already been paid by Jesus, our Lord. And so we remove the offense from the offender. And really, in a lot of ways, this goes back to what Jake talked about in his well-thought-out, well-planned communion meditation today, when he says we have to take and keep in mind the circumstances people are coming from when they do these things to us. And that helps us build empathy. Now, empathy is not excusing it, but it helps us understand, man, do you understand what this person is going through? Because a lot of times, people are going through things when they offend us, when they cause pain for us. They're focused on themselves, not on us, and they're going through stuff. Most people are going through stuff most of the time, right? And so it makes it hard to bring your best to every relationship. But Dr. Smedes goes on to say it this way. You disengage that person from the hurtful act. You think of that person not as the person who hurt you, but as the person who needs you. Ouch. When I think about a lot of the pain in my life over the last 30 years, it's taken place in settings like this. Maybe I've done something to hurt someone, and they've kept that hurt, and so all of a sudden they do something to hurt me. I remember, and I don't have to worry about him hearing about this because they don't have the internet in heaven as far as I know, and Dwayne's been gone a long time, but we had an elder who was who one Christmas Eve, it was Christmas Eve, came up to me and just let me have it over something. And it was, I don't think it was anything big. We were thinking about starting a Sunday school class at a cafe because we needed room for a Sunday school class. We were out of room, and there was a little cafe not far from us. Oh, it was actually the Pizza Hut. It was not far from us. Well, they don't serve pizza on Sunday morning very often, you know. So I'd asked the manager if it'd even be possible that we could maybe have a class there while they were getting their opening stuff done and everything. He's like, oh, that'd be fine. That'd be no problem. Well, word somehow got back to Dwayne that we were starting a Sunday school class at that Pizza Hut. Now, I hadn't talked to the elders about it yet, which usually I would do that. But I didn't even know if this was even a possibility. I was just trying to do my homework ahead of time and bring it to the table. But Christmas Eve, he decided to unload on me. And I think we were there for an hour. My family was waiting. It was a holiday. We just had this beautiful Christmas Eve service. And he was just letting me have it. His family was out in the car, and I don't just mean his kids. His kids had grown. His kids had come back and brought their kids, and they waited out in the parking lot for an hour while Dwayne unloaded it on me. Merry Christmas. I was frustrated, and I was hurt, and I wasn't very smart. I just let it go. He came to the next elders meeting. I had been preaching on giving and tithing, and I made this little comment. People will ask sometimes, now, when God tells us to tithe, does he expect us to give 10% on our gross or on our net? And there's a guy by the name of Gene Apple, and Gene Apple used to preach in Las Vegas. Gene said, you know, the only difference between preaching in Las Vegas and preaching everywhere else is that they pay you in quarters in Vegas, you know. And he went on to talk about this concept one time. I was listening to him talk about giving, and this is how he handled that question. He said, well, it just depends on whether you want a net blessing or a gross blessing. Do you want God to bless you on the net or the gross? You know, it's like, so I made that comment. Dwayne came to the next elders meeting with the books from his farm, and he put them out before us, and he was fit to be tied, and he was angry, and he was upset. And he said, you show me how I'm supposed to tithe on the net. or on the gross. You show me how I'm supposed to tithe on the gross. I didn't get in an argue with him. I didn't show him how to do it. I didn't look at his books. I said, Dwayne, is there something we need to talk about? You seem like you've been really upset lately with me. And he closed the books and he says, I have. And so we made an appointment. And I went and sat down with him. I told you he blew up with me at Christmas. At Easter, before Christmas, it wasn't like he only came those 2 times a year. He came every Sunday. He was a faithful man. But he came and he said, you know, when I told you at Easter that my brother had a heart attack, you didn't pray for him. You never even told the church about it. It was like you forgot all about it. We pray for all these other people that I don't know, these people that don't even come to our church most of the time, but you didn't even ask me about my brother. Haven't asked me since. I didn't even remember him telling me about his brother. You know, it was Easter Sunday morning. We had tons of things going on. It was a big day. I had stuff going on. He had stuff going on. And all of a sudden, we had a mess. The devil let that mess fester in Dwayne's heart from Easter to Christmas to that elders meeting. And for 8 or 9 months, we didn't have anything. So when we sat down and we talked, he shared that with me. And I said, Dwayne, I'm so sorry. I didn't remember you telling me that. Well, it was in line when you were shaking people out. Well, I probably should have called and talked to you. Still, it was on me. It was easily resolved. It could have been easily resolved 8 months before if we just would have acknowledged the pain and the hurt that took place in it. Then he said, I guess also I've been started taking this blood pressure medication that makes me kind of quick to get angry. And you know, Dwayne and I were never closer than after we reconciled that moment. Something just about acknowledging that we've been hurt that gives us an opportunity to provide, for God to provide the healing that we need in the midst of moments like this. I want to repeat what Smead said because I think this is so important and it's what I overlooked. He said, you think of him now not as the person who hurt you, but as the person who needs you. When you can take and remove the sin that took place and slice away the pain and remove the action from the human being that was responsible for it, it makes room for God to begin to heal that. It's literally like going in and having that tumor cut out. Now, you may still need some radiation, you may still need some chemotherapy, you may still need some work like that. But this is a different person in your mind now. That's how Smead is talking about this. He says you can start over. Now, you may not be able to continue in a relationship with that person. It may not go the way it went with Dwayne and I. I get that. But you try, you do your best, as Paul writes in Romans, you do your best to live at peace with one another, with everybody, live at peace with everybody the best you can. But sometimes people just reject it. They reject your forgiveness, they reject your love, and you can still have a different relationship with them. If you apply Smead's idea here, you remove the pain and the hurt and the thing that caused it, and you look at them as a forgiven human being, like you are a forgiven human being. I was once having a difficult time forgiving somebody. And it wasn't for the way they treated me, it was for the way they treated somebody else. And I had this other elder that came alongside me, and we had this discussion. And he said, when the two of you get to heaven, it'll be the same blood that purchased your entrance. The same blood that covers my sin is the same blood that covers my enemy's sin or that person I'm having a problem with. It's the same blood. So when we see that person, we need to remember the blood of Jesus that was shed for our forgiveness and for theirs, that we can forgive and let go of their forgiveness. Now, let's talk about forging faith forgiveness. I almost called this fake forgiveness, like fake news, but I decided to call it kind of like forgery. Sometimes we just fake forgiveness. And let me give you a few signs and struggles with doing that. When we fake forgiveness, sorry, I want to get into this after the video. Okay, so I want to show you this video. This is about a 4-minute video because I think I want us to understand what forgiveness can look like and how do we go about getting it. So let's watch this video from Doug Fields real quick. It has volume. It did earlier today. Thank you.
I can't tell you the many, many times students have asked me, how am I ever going to forgive this person? And my response is always the same. Well, if you don't forgive that person, you'll never be able to live life to its fullest. Because the lack of forgiveness is like this straitjacket that just kind of keeps you trapped. It keeps you from living life to its fullest. It will keep you from having significant relationships. It will keep you from loving God. It'll keep you from making a difference in the world. Forgiveness is one of the best things you can do. I mean, if you just want to be selfish and say, I'm going to forgive just so I can move on, great. But let me give you a real practical idea. Why don't you just say this? I release you from the hurt that you've caused me. Now, if you can say it to the person face to face, that'll be very healing. Maybe you need to write it, or maybe you just need to say it over and over again. I release you from the hurt that you've caused me. Because in order to forgive somebody, you've had to have been hurt in some way. And that person now kind of owes you a debt. I want to that's where revenge comes from. I want to get them back. Instead, just say, I release you from the hurt that you've caused me because I want to move on. I want to move on and experience life and enjoy life. And the deeper the hurt, the more often you will have to do that. For example, I remember a guy hurt me very badly, and I said, I forgive you, I release you from the hurt that you caused me. And then I saw him about a year later, and as soon as I saw him, I was just like, I felt all that anger again, and I had to do it again and again and again, where now I can sit here and go, you know what, now that anger has kind of turned to compassion because I feel kind of sad for him. I have no hard feelings whatsoever, but I had to forgive him many, many times. When you're in a situation where you think, there's no way in the world I can forgive my parent, they've betrayed me, they've hurt me, they've wounded me, they've treated me so terribly, I just will never be able to forgive them. And I understand it may feel like that right now. And you may feel like you're dying in a pile and you've been so wounded by the people that should provide you the love and the nurture and the attention that you need. And I understand those feelings of hurt and anger. But I also understand that people who live with those feelings don't really live. They're paralyzed. They don't move on in life. They don't have healthy relationships. Let me just tell you this. You can't do it on your own. You can't forgive them on your own power, because on your own power, all you will feel is anger and hatred. But you can forgive them when you trust and depend on God's power. When you say, God, I can't do this on my own. And you can go through the whole deal of saying, I release you from the hurt that you've caused me, and you should do that, but you've got to depend on God's power. God knows a little something about forgiveness. And you will never have to forgive somebody more than God has already forgiven you. So when you understand that big picture of God's forgiveness for you, that it was possible for Him to forgive you so that now you could live the life He wants you to live, you need to then take that whole big picture of forgiveness and say, okay, what God has shown me, I've got to figure out to show it to my parents or to somebody who's wounded me deeply, but I can't do it on my own power. So I'm going to drop to my knees. I'm going to ask God for the strength. I'm going to bring my Christian friends around and hold me accountable. And I'm going to continue to say, I release you from that hurt that you've caused me because God has forgiven me and I'm a different person. And I'm not going to allow my anger to trap me and paralyze me from not living the incredible Christian life that God wants me to live.
So I want to practice this together. I put that phrase up there. We don't have to say Doug Fields, but let's say this out loud together so we can cement this in our mind. I release you from the hurt you have caused me. Now I want you to think about that person, the hurt that you have in your life. If there's somebody that has hurt you, I want you to imagine yourself, just picture yourself, and let's say it again. Picture yourself saying this to them. I release you from the hurt you have caused me. That's harder when you know who you're saying it to. And it's probably going to be harder yet to actually say it. But maybe that's what you need to be able to move on. Maybe you have that opportunity, maybe you don't, I don't know. But here's what I do know. I know there's a lot of forgeries for forgiveness. This is what forgiveness looks like. It's like releasing. It's just letting it go. I'm going to let go of that hurt. I'm going to let God collect on that debt. I don't have to be the one that does that. Here's the first forgery we see. Let's forget about it. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering to forgive. We'll get to this in a minute. There's another pro that we're going to hear from before the end of the day. But the bottom line is, you may have to forgive somebody more than once. Matter of fact, for the same hurt. You may have to continue to forgive. They may only hurt you once, but it may take a lot of forgiving to get there. You may have to continue to let go, to continue to release. And you might say, well, how many times do I do that? Do I do that like 7 times or 70 times 7? How often should I forgive? How often do you want to be forgiven? The second forgery, I think, is this idea of excusing. We make excuses. Oh, it didn't hurt that bad. Oh, it was really not a problem. I let go of that a long time ago. Sometimes that's true. But often we just don't want to accept the pain that it caused us and let go of that pain because of something that it's triggering in us. Here's the third forgery. It's just smoothing things over. You know, this person hurts you and you're like, oh, let's go. I got to keep working with this person, so let's just go smooth things over so we can keep working together. And you hold on to the bitterness and the pain, but you just learn to swallow hard when that person comes into the room, or clench your fists, or tighten your jaw. But forgiving is not smoothing things over. It's admitting our hurt and addressing the wounds. Now, if you think back to the Old Testament, God did this himself in some ways. He didn't just overlook Israelites' sin. They paid for it. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, which, you know, a lot of us look at and say, that's just craziness. But understand the purpose of it. If you go through and look, for example, in Leviticus 16, and you look at the Day of Atonement, and you look at the great lengths that God went to, what he did was he demonstrated to the Israelites that their pain caused suffering. And there's this beautiful moment in the midst of their celebration where they would take a goat and they would transfer their sins and curses to this goat. Now, some of their sins took sacrifice, but then there's this goat, the scapegoat, and they would transfer. The priest would put the sins of the people on the goat, and they would set the goat free to run wild. And that was the scapegoat. You know what that was? That was God saying to his people, I release you from the hurt you have caused me. I release your sins. I'm not going to count these against you anymore. One of the other things that Doug said in this video that I really appreciated at the end, he said, you will never have to forgive someone for more than God has forgiven you. And if you don't believe that, I doubt that you really understand that you've been forgiven and what it has cost for your forgiveness. And I'm sorry about that. In part, that means I haven't done a very good job of preaching. This is what we celebrate when we come here. This is what we celebrate around the table every week. Our sin has been paid for. Its penalty has been paid. We've been released. And there's nothing that anybody else can do to you that compares to what God has already forgiven you for. We'll get to that in a moment when we talk about this last pro. Well, Actually, we're about out of time, so let's talk about the last pro. If there was ever a professional forgiver, it was Jesus, right? It literally was his calling to come. It was his final words from the cross as he looked down at the people who had crucified him and he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, but forgive them. He doesn't say excuse them. He doesn't say, oh, forget about it. He calls to his memory the importance of forgiveness. Let's look at a few of the things that Jesus says, and this isn't going to be long. I'm not extending the service here. I'd hate for you to go to church and say, hey, we learned what Lewis Smedes had to say about forgiveness. Or we heard what C.S. Lewis had to say, or we heard what Doug Fields had to say, or we heard what Corey Miller had to say. This is what Jesus had to say. In Mark chapter 11, looking at verse 25, he simply said this. This is after he cursed the fig tree, the withered fig tree that wasn't producing. And his disciples are asking him, and he's talking about prayer. And in verse 25, he says, and when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him so your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. You know, we didn't address the question today of why should we forgive, but this addresses it. You will not have an intimate relationship with God until you accept the hurt and pain that others have caused you and forgive them for it as well. Because you'll never understand the need to forgive and the price of forgiveness that God paid for your own sin. I think that's why in Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus is teaching the disciples how to pray, he says, when you pray, and he gives them the model. And there's a ton of things that we pray about all the time that don't show up in that model. But one thing that does show up in that model is this idea. And forgive us our debts, trespasses, our sin, as we forgive those who are debtors, our trespassers, those who sin against us. And he even goes down further in verses 14 and 15. He goes on and he repeats, and he basically says what he said in Mark. He says, for if you don't forgive, your Father's not going to forgive you. Well, that's plenty of the why, but what about the how? Well, Matthew 18 is one of the best chapters on forgiveness in Scripture. It's what moves my heart. It teaches us how to forgive, and it's story after story after story about how we should forgive and make things right with people. But in this story, in one of these stories in Matthew 18, Jesus says something that I think we really need to hold on to. In verse 21, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7 times, which was also just symbolic for every time it happens, forgive. And he goes on and he helps us understand it by telling this story about the unmerciful servant, this servant who was forgiven a small debt but refused to forgive, or was forgiven a big debt but refused to let go of a small debt. And God, in that story, he shows me every time that I tend to be that guy in my life. I think that I'm God in that story, like the master, like I'm owed this huge debt. When the reality is I'm owed a small debt by anybody or anything that's ever harmed me. It's a small debt. It's easy to forgive, but I've got a lifetime of debt of indebtedness to God that he just wipes clean. And in case you think the early church didn't think this way, do you remember what Ryan read to us this morning? Ryan read for us from Colossians chapter 3. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Can I just suggest that when you go to reconcile with your friend, don't go naked. What I mean is clothe yourself with these things. Don't go wearing your wounds on your sleeve. Take the time and remind yourself who you are. You've been clothed with the compassion of Jesus, with the kindness of Jesus, with the humility of Jesus, with the gentleness of Jesus, with the patience of Jesus. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And I guarantee you, it's not 7 times. It's not even 70 times 7 for me. The Lord has forgiven so much in my life and in your life too. Here's the bottom line of today's message. Hurt people hurt people. You're going to have people that hurt you. They're going to sin against you. You are going to hurt people. I've been around you. You're going to hurt people. I'm going to hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. But forgiven people forgive people. When you recognize what Christ has done in your life, when you recognize the pain that you've caused him to endure, and he chose to endure on our behalf, you realize what's the price that's been paid for our sin. Oh, just that grace overflows in your heart, and you want to share it. You want to forgive. Would you stand and worship with us?